fiction is a lie that tells a truth. Versions of that line have been attributed to and misattributed to multiple people. But even if we don't know exactly who uttered that statement for the first time, it still serves as a helpful point of departure for our module on fiction. In this mini lesson, I'll talk about that characteristic of fiction, although I'll use a more polite term than lie. I'll also talk about some of the ancient predecessors of modern fiction, and some of the shared vocabulary we will use to talk about, and ultimately to write about, our readings for this module of our Introduction to Literature class. Speaking of our readings, for this second full module of our class, we'll be reading the shorter fictions Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, The Pedestrian by Ray Bradbury, and The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. We'll also start to read the longer fiction Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, although we will not finish that until the third module. Again, you'll notice science fiction themes in the readings for this second module, which should hopefully help you to make interesting connections between the poems we read in our first full module and the dramas we'll read in our third full module. All right. So, first, let's talk about that notion of fiction as a lie. In my earlier mini lesson, What's the Genre of Literature?, I talked a bit about prose in general and told you we would be reading fiction in specific this semester. And I listed a couple of crucial observable differences in terms of structure and presentation between the genre of fiction and the genres of poetry and drama. Namely, that it is written in sentences, organized into paragraphs, and intended for an audience of readers. And, I should add, that fiction almost always takes the form of narrative, which is the fancy professor term for story. In this mini lesson, I should also add that there is a fourth genre of literature, which is a second form of prose that we are not exploring in this particular class section of Introduction to Literature. That's nonfiction. The essential difference between these two genres of prose, fiction and nonfiction, is that fiction is, well, fictional, and nonfiction is factual. That is, when we read, what we read about in fictional stories is understood to be not true, and what we read about in non-fictional essays is understood to be true. If we were to consult the source, synonyms for fictional that might help us to go beyond that simplified definition of not true include invented or imagined. So, those more polite terms I mentioned before, instead of thinking of fictions as lies, let's instead think of them as works of invention or imagination. And if we were to consult an etymology dictionary, that is, a reference book that traces the origins of words and the changes in their meanings over time, we might get an even more complex understanding. In an etymology dictionary, we could trace our modern English word fiction back to the Middle English word fiction, the Old French word fiction, and the Latin word fictionem. And that's where we get to the true root of fiction, because the Latin noun fictionem came from the verb fingere, which meant to shape or to form. Because even when writers draw inspiration for fiction from real-life events, they then shape them into a form that can exert what Edgar Allan Poe famously called a singular effect on their readers. To learn more about Poe's profoundly influential concept of the singular effect of a prose story, we'll be reading his 1842 review of Nathaniel Hawthorne's celebrated collection, Twice Told Tales, in this module. If you would like to read perhaps the strongest example of the singular effect in one of Poe's own stories, I would recommend The Telltale Heart. Poe had an explicit preference for shorter forms of fiction, which he called tales back then. Now, we tend to call them short stories. Longer forms of fiction we tend to call novels. Speaking of the lengths of forms of fiction, let's take a minute to talk about the approximate word counts. A novel tends to be more than 50,000 words. A typical length, though, is between 80,000 and 100,000 words. A novella tends to be between 20,000 and 50,000 words. A novelette tends to be between 7,500 and 20,000 words. Some definitions, though, set the boundary between a novelette and a novella at 17,500 words instead. A short story tends to be between 1,000 and 10,000 words. A short story, which is the form of fiction that I concentrate on when I teach creative writing, tends to be a short story of less than 2,000 words. And a flash fiction tends to be fewer than 1,000 words. However long or short the forms writers shake them into, if they're fiction, those stories will almost always be narratives written in sentences, organized into paragraphs, and intended for an audience of readers. And they will be fictional, that is, invented or imagined. Although our conceptions of those forms of modern fiction are relatively recent, they certainly had ancient predecessors, which went by names such as allegories, fables, and parables. In literary terms, an allegory is understood to be an expression of a truth about human existence through fictional characters and their symbolic actions, which could be interpreted by readers to teach a meaningful moral lesson. One of the most famous of these is Plato's allegory of the cave, an excerpt from Republic that, again, we'll be reading in this module. Fables and parables are specialized forms of allegories. Fables, which you may associate with Aesop, tend to use personified animals to teach their moral lessons. Think of the tortoise and the hare. Parables, which you may associate with Jesus, tend to use persons, that is, human characters, to teach their moral lessons. Think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, not all modern fiction is meant to teach a moral lesson, but when we study literature, we are definitely looking for deeper meanings that may seem hidden beneath the surface-level elements. Speaking of those surface-level elements, let's start to build the shared vocabulary we will use to talk about, and ultimately to write about, our readings for this module of our Introduction to Literature class. First, it is often convenient to divide fictions into scenes when we talk or write about them. Let's think of a scene for now as simply a part of a story that happens at one place at one time. Second, when they create scenes, writers tend to establish a setting, that is both the place and the time, the where and the when of the story they want to tell. Third, they want to populate that setting with characters. Those are the people, the who in their story. After that, our fourth, fifth, and sixth, for those of you keeping track at home, they want those characters to take actions and to exchange dialogue. Those are the what's in their story. The actions are what the characters do. The dialogue is what the characters say. Here, I should point out that fiction more readily lends itself to authors also incorporating thoughts, that is, the what the characters think. Seventh, to make their story more interesting to their readers, writers want that combination of actions and dialogue and thoughts to create suspense, the type of anxiety we feel when we don't know what's going to happen next. Now, writers tend to employ a structure to give shape to those elements. A profoundly influential structure comes from Gustav Freytag's 1863 book, Technique of the Drama, from which we'll, you guessed it, read an excerpt that I call 5 Parts and 3 Crises. As you'll read in that excerpt, Freytag's analysis of plays such as William Shakespeare's Hamlet led him to believe the stories are composed of 5 parts that he arranged in a pyramidal structure. You'll often see creative writing or literature teachers sketch out this pyramid from Freytag, even if they don't often mention his name. The terms that Freytag used to describe these 5 parts of dramas were introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, and catastrophe. He called the last part catastrophe because he was analyzing a lot of tragedies, which do end catastrophically for their main characters. Nowadays, we tend to label this 5th part of the drama the resolution instead, and we often label the first part as the exposition instead. Well, I've put Freytag's terms introduction and catastrophe on my diagram because, after all, I am a teacher of literature and creative writing. I have also written out our more modern terms exposition and resolution. I've also added the term action, which is meant to encompass Freytag's rising action, climax, and falling action. The exposition section of a story tends to be where writers introduce their setting and characters. The action section is where, you guessed it, we tend to see most of the actions, which tend to first rise toward the climax and then fall away from it. The climax, for Freytag, was the most important part in the structure, often where the main character takes an action that changes the direction of not only the story, but also their life. And resolution tends to be where the writer communicates, whether explicitly or implicitly, the outcome of the story for the main character. So that will be the starter set of our shared vocabulary for talking and writing about fiction. Scenes, setting, characters, action, dialogue, thoughts, suspense, structure, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution.